Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Perspectives in FTD Research Webinar, Why PSP and CSP Clinical Trials Matter. This webinar is being presented jointly by the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration and the FTD Disorders Registry. My name is Carrie Millard, and I'm the director of the registry. Thank you all for joining us. I want to mention a few things before we get started. The audience will be muted throughout the webinar to keep the background noise at a minimum. If you encounter any technical issues, please write a message in the question box and someone working behind the scenes will try and address that. Time permitting, we will have a brief Q&A at the end of the presentation. If at any point during the webinar you think of a question you'd like to ask our presenter, please type it into the questions box. You don't need to wait until the Q&A portion begins to submit your question. This webinar will be recorded and archived for later viewing on the YouTube pages of both AFTD and the FTD Disorders Registry. This Perspectives in FTD Research webinar is made possible through the support of Alector. Thank you to the folks at Alector for their generous sponsorship of all of our work. As mentioned, I'm the director of the FTD Disorders Registry, which is a powerful tool in the movement to discover treatments and a cure for FTD. The registry relies on stories of people like you, persons diagnosed with FTD, current and former caregivers, family members, and friends. Your stories and experiences will help to spur innovation that will lead to effective treatments and therapies. If FTD has touched your life in some way, I strongly encourage you to join the thousands of people who have already signed up for the registry. Registration allows you to receive periodic news and FTD research updates by email, as well as notifications to participate in surveys and research studies to help further the science of FTD. Finally, the AFTD is planning the next AFTD Education Conference. Registration won't be open until the new year, so for now you can save the date. The conference will be held Friday, May 3rd in Houston, Texas. This annual conference brings together persons affected by FTD, experts in the field, and other healthcare professionals for a full day of learning and connection. If you can't make it to Houston, you'll be able to follow along with our free live stream, and many sessions will be recorded for later viewing. And now I'd like to introduce our guest presenter. Dr. Anne-Marie Wills is a neurologist specializing in neurodegenerative diseases, including PSP. She received her BA from Princeton University, her MD from Columbia College Physicians and Surgeons, and her MPH from Harvard School of Public Health. She's been on staff at Massachusetts General Hospital since 2006. Currently, Dr. Wills is the director of the CurePSP Center of Care at Mass General, which provides multidisciplinary care for people with PSP. And now I will turn things over to Dr. Wills.
Thank you, Carrie. That's great. Just to reiterate, this is I'm a neurologist at Mass General. I specialize in PSP and corticobasal syndrome, and I was asked to talk about these sort of allied diseases and how they relate to FTD because of my interest in clinical trials and clinical research. And so I'm going to talk sort of in the broad picture of how these diseases are related to FTD, and then we'll talk a bit about clinical trials. Next slide. So these are my disclosures. Importantly, I am involved in some clinical trials that are upcoming, including one by Alector Pharmaceuticals for PSP and one by Ono Pharmaceuticals for MSA. I'm going to talk about the Alector trial a little bit here. Next. So this is the general outline. So we're going to talk first of all about PSP and corticobasal syndrome and FTD, how they're related. Then we're going to talk about tauopathies in general, treatments and potential therapies that are being researched right now for tauopathies. We'll talk about clinical trials specifically, and in general, we'll talk about how to get involved in clinical trials. I'm going to try to walk people through sort of the nitty-gritty of how to sign up for clinical trials. Next. So what are tauopathies? So tauopathies is this sort of big umbrella term for diseases of the brain that are caused or associated with deposition of tau protein. Now that is a protein that is important in the cells. We'll talk about that. But in these diseases, it becomes abnormal and you get too much tau protein, and you can see it in both neurons and in supporting glial cells. And that is how we sort of define these diseases, what they look like under the microscope. So there's different types of tauopathy, sort of different strains. It's based mostly on sort of the length of the tau protein. So with FTD, a lot of times there will be the 3-repeat tau and 4-repeat tau, both types of proteins you can see under the microscope. And then with PSP and CBS, they're called 4-repeat tauopathies. These are sort of subtleties of neuropathology that you definitely don't need to know and you don't need to memorize. It's just sort of the idea is that all of these diseases have some underlying similarities that we believe are causing the degeneration of the neurons in the brain. Next. So this is to show you sort of what those neurons look like under the microscope. And so as you can see on the right, different diseases will look different under the microscope. These are cells that have been stained specifically for tau. So in red, you can see the tau, and you can see how they're filling different neurons on the top left with accumulated protein. It's sort of clogging up the cells. And then on the right, you can see that in, for example, PSP, it also affects the supporting cells, the glial cells. So this is just a visual of how these different diseases look under the microscope. And it gives you an idea that, you know, even though they are all related tauopathies, there are differences in terms of the pathology that can also help explain why they look different clinically. Next. So the next question is, what is tau? So tau is it's a really important protein in your cells that binds to the microtubules, and the microtubules are basically the skeleton of your neurons. So you may remember from biology, your neurons are incredibly long. You'll have neurons that start up here in the brain and they go all the way down to the base of your spine. So they have these really, really, really long axons. So they need a supporting structure, like a backbone, to support those axons, and that's the microtubules. And so the tau protein helps to support that skeleton, and when it is abnormal, when it's not functioning well, that can actually break apart. And so then the neurons get sick and they degenerate and they pull back and they can die. And so right now, you know, tau is working for you. It is a normal part of everybody's brain. It's very important to have. But then when tau goes wrong, you get this type of degeneration of the neurons. And part of that is due to the clumping of tau that you can see under the microscope in the slides that I just showed. Next. So how does tau go wrong? So first of all, you can have mutations in the tau gene. Second of all, you can have changes in the way it's processed and the way it's folded, and the different phosphorylation, different modifications that happen to the tau protein after it's made. You can also, through trauma, for example, trauma can injure those long axons, and it can cause shearing. It can cause the tau protein to fall off the microtubules. It can cause it to aggregate. And so basically, through multiple pathways, you can get to problems with tau, misfolded, clumping, forming these aggregates that really gum up the cell, and they seem to gum up the normal pathways of the cell for clearing bad proteins or misfolded proteins. And that's where you get these inclusions. Next. So the next question is, what do we do about tau? And so this is sort of the overall question for all of our tauopathies. How do we treat them? How are we going to prevent tau or bad tau from becoming a problem for neurons? And so a bunch of different mechanisms are in the works and being experimented with right now. The first one is using what are called antisense oligonucleotides to reduce the amount of tau that is being made. Next, there are special inhibitors that are working on that post-translational modification. So working on how the tau is sort of folded in the correct manner after it's made. And then there are microtubule stabilizers and tau aggregation inhibitors. Those are supposed to prevent the abnormal tau from clumping so much. It's actually really interesting because tau aggregation inhibitors in theory could maybe be helpful in other aggregation diseases such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. All these diseases have different aggregations of different types of proteins, but they all have this kind of similar issue of the proteins binding together and then becoming problems for the cell. There's also a lot of work that's being done in terms of passive immunity or active immunity. So trying to clear out the tau protein using antibodies. And so there have already been a couple trials that tested this. Other antibodies are in the works that are trying to attach to different parts of the tau protein and try to clear it out. So this is just sort of a big overview of all the different types of therapies that are in the works and being worked on. We don't know what's going to work. This is sort of why we do clinical research, is we're trying to find treatments and therapies to slow down or reverse these diseases. Next. Okay, so in general, how could targeting tau help with both PSP and FTD? And we believe this is because abnormal tau is present in all of these tauopathies. So if you were to come up with a treatment that worked in PSP, we think it would work in FTD as well. And in general, the only way to really move these treatments forward is through clinical trials. So first, you start in the lab and you try different drugs and you see what works either in cell culture or in animal models. And then you start to move that forward into human trials. And that's what we call sort of bench to bedside. And that's sort of where you come in. That's where you, as a research participant, can really help other people with these diseases. So next. So this is just a big overview of the different types of research. So there's observational studies, which are things like imaging studies, genetics, like DNA studies, biomarkers, and then the registry study, like the one that AFTD supports. And then there are intervention studies, and this is what people normally think of when they think of research. They think of drug trials. So symptomatic trials or disease-modifying trials, these are intervention studies. And generally, the sort of gold standard intervention study is the double-blind, randomized clinical trial. So here is an example. Both the patient and the treating physician, the person who's running the study, should be blind to whether they're getting the drug or the placebo in order not to bias them about the outcomes. So that's why it's called double blind. Next. So in terms of observational studies, these are some examples of some of the work that's come from different types of observational studies. So the first one on the left, this is work that was done by Chihiro Sato at WashU that was published recently, where she took CSF that had been donated by volunteers with a whole bunch of these tauopathies, and then she was able to look at the little pieces of tau that are in the CSF, and she was able to identify a few fragments that seemed to be differently expressed or more common or elevated in some of the tauopathies that we were just talking about. And this is really exciting because this could potentially be a way of diagnosing some of these diseases with a really clear, objective, laboratory measure. And the challenge, of course, is that this type of research, it requires hundreds of people to volunteer and to undergo a lumbar puncture and to donate their spinal fluid to discover things like this. But it's really, really important, and we think that this is the type of research that's really going to help with diagnosis in the future. On the right, there are, these are some images from a special type of PET scan where they took a dye, a radioactive dye that actually binds to tau and lights it up in the brain. So you can show it here with these types of images. And this is a little bit of an older study. This is work that's still in development. Nobody has really come up with a perfect tau binding dye that can differentiate between the tauopathies like PSP and CBS compared to something like Alzheimer's, as you can see down here, where the Alzheimer's brain is lighting up quite a bit. So that's one of the challenges in terms of making it a diagnostic tool, is that there's a lot of tau in other types of diseases as well. So, but this is also really interesting, and we're really hopeful about the results of these types of studies. Next. So just an overview of clinical trials in general. So you start out with these preclinical studies in the lab with mouse models, things like that. And then you start to work in humans. Typically, you start with the phase 1 early safety studies will be just healthy controls. And these will be people who will volunteer for research and just to test the safety and make sure that it's safe for humans to test. And then you start to work into the phase 2 and phase 3 studies. The phase 2 studies, classically, this is to test dose finding, to see what the right dose is that will give you some sort of a readout. And that might be using a biomarker, that might be using a clinical scale, but something that gives you the idea that this might really work. And then you move into the phase 3 studies, and those are the really big ones that require thousands of participants. And that's what is so challenging in diseases that are rare, is how do we do trials that are big enough, with thousands of people. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this webinar, is to try to encourage people to volunteer their time and their effort to help move these types of trials forward. So that's just sort of a general overview of clinical trials. Next. So these are the benefits, in my mind, of participating in clinical research. So first of all, it's really valuable to learn more about the disease, both you personally, your family, and then also just the field in general, knowing more about how this disease progresses, about the underlying cause of the disease, and what to predict, how to follow disease, also will help in terms of finding treatments and cures for the disease. So we always tell people, yes, this may not help you personally. When you enroll in a clinical trial, it may not help you personally. It may help the next group of people who gets this disease. But so there is a selflessness, and there's sort of an act of goodness that goes into participating in these trials. As I said before, it's really important for clinical trials to move the science forward to find treatments and cures for these diseases. There are some additional benefits that are sort of more immediate. For example, if you enroll in clinical trials, you often get to work with specialists at different research centers who might focus on these diseases specifically. So they might be able to give you additional feedback about treatments and things that might be beneficial to you directly. I think it's really valuable to have that feeling of autonomy and that feeling that you're able to take charge of the illness and fight the illness and do things to really combat it. And that's one of the, I think, the most valuable things about being in research, is that empowering feeling that you are doing something to really help you and future generations with these diseases. And I always want to tell people, yes, it's a huge team effort. There's a lot of people involved, but you as a research participant are the most important person in all of these studies. And it's always up to you whether you participate, how long you want to participate. You always have the right to withdraw from the study if you don't want to participate. So it's very much sort of your decision. Next. So after thinking about this, if you are interested in participating in clinical trials, these are my steps for how to get involved. First of all, you should talk to the doctor who's treating you about clinical research and if they know of any clinical trials. Next, you can go to the AFTD website. You can go to CurePSP as well, and individuals there can help you to navigate finding clinical trials. I'll also show you the clinicaltrials.gov website after this. Once you find a trial that you're interested in, read the consent form and ask questions before enrolling. The most important thing to remember is that your safety and privacy are the most important parts of research. Those should never be violated. And all the clinical trials that are being conducted in the US have to follow the good clinical practice guidelines. Next. So there are some very easy steps to get involved. For example, the FTD Registry is an easy way to sign up. It allows you to, participate in research from the comfort of your home. You can talk, you can do questionnaires, you can do surveys, you can do things that are sort of the observational studies that we were talking about, where it's more about how the disease progresses and measuring outcome measures and things like that. One of the great things about the FTD registry also is that it allows you to be notified about clinical trials when they become available. So especially if you qualify, if you fulfill all the inclusion criteria for a clinical trial, then you should be notified if there's a study that's going to be coming up. That would be good for you. Next. This is the clinicaltrials.gov website. So this is not the easiest website to navigate. And so I wanted to put in just a couple screenshots to make it a little bit easier. So if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you can search by disease. So for example, if you want to put in PSP, you can text search for PSP. And then you can also filter on the left here. You have all these, it says focus your search. So see, we have PSP at the top here. Then you can add filters like recruiting or not yet recruiting. You can look for the different phases of disease. For example, if you want to only do phase 2 or phase 3 trials, you can put that in. You can also filter by location in terms of where you live, what state you live in. So those are all ways to make it easier to use this website. Next. One of the things that the older clinicaltrials.gov website allowed you to do actually was to create a visual map of all the sites all around the world that are doing clinical research. So if you it's hard to navigate to now, but I did a search recently for PSP trials, and so it pulled up 24 trials here in the US. Now, admittedly, a lot of those trials are going to be observational. A lot of them are going to be single center, so it's not as impressive as it sounds. But the basic this is sort of to give you an idea on a global scale of where trials are happening. And as you can see, you know, mostly US and Western Europe. But this map actually does allow you to zoom in on your state, which is rather cool. And you can see like how many trials are going on in your state. So sorry, this is the website is up here at the top bar. This is the older version of clinical trials that had this search, this visual search function. Next. So one clinical trial that is actually about to start enrolling in PSP is a drug that has recently been approved in ALS. And so this is a company called Alector. And I put just an example of one of the papers that came out from the ALS study on the right, where it did show a slowing down of, or an improvement in survival for people who were given this drug. And so it is actually now approved for ALS. It is about to start as a randomized controlled trial in PSP, and there are sites all over the US and actually all over the world that are going to be enrolling. It's just starting up though, so you may not have heard anything about it yet, but it should be starting very, very soon. Next. This is a platform trial, which is a really great idea, which we're still waiting to hear if it's going to be funded by the NIH, just because of all the politics going on right now in Washington, D.C. We don't know if it's going to be funded, but it should be funded. This is a study that Adam Boxer at UCSF on the far left initiated, where the idea is to create a structure that will make it easier to try different therapies with smaller numbers of participants in a more efficient way. So the idea is you run multiple different drugs all at the same time, all in the same centers, using the same protocol and using the same placebo group. And that way fewer people have to take placebo and you get the efficiencies of scale. It's much more efficient, obviously, to do multiple trials than to do, you know, them individually, sequentially. So we're really hopeful that this is going to get funded, that this is going to be able to accelerate drug discovery in PSP, hopefully as early as next year, touching wood. So there will be more information to come about that one. Next. So this is just my sort of personal wish list for research. We obviously need better diagnostic tools. We're still working on imaging and biomarkers to try to both diagnose and measure disease progression. We need better animal models. We need to work on our outcome measures. That's what I'm personally working on. And then hopefully, if we get all of this done and we, you know, all work together on different clinical trials, we'll be able to come up with therapies that will slow down not just PSP, but also CBS and FTD and all the tauopathies. So that's the ultimate goal here. Next. All right, and that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to hand it back. I think we have a video next. All right, so Ken and Michelle, thank you so much for participating today. We talked a little bit about what this webinar is about, but we were hoping that we could start out with just a brief introduction to who you are and what your experience has been living with PSP.
You want to start?
I'm Ken Curtis. I live with PSP for about 10 years. It's been difficult, but thank God I have my wife with me. It's been, she's my mouthpiece and my, my rock. She's been the reason I've been able to participate in various trials.
Michelle, do you want to give us a little background on yourself?
Hello, I'm Michelle. I'm Ken's wife. We will be married for 44 years in September.
Yes.
And they've been a great 44 years. As Ken said, he's probably had PSP for about 10 years, maybe a little, somewhere in that range. One of the first challenges was having it diagnosed, because he had symptoms for many, many years that were not able to be diagnosed. We saw multiple doctors in multiple ways. I recall he was falling a lot, and we actually went to have him have a knee replacement with a wonderful doctor here, who said, well, he does need a new knee because he's got bone on bone, but it's not going to stop him from falling. So he was aware of the situation, which was interesting at the time. The diagnosis was challenging when we got it, but it was also helpful in that it explained an awful lot of the lifestyle changes that had occurred prior to the diagnosis. He had exhibited many of the emotional and personal symptoms of PSP, and no one could understand why he wasn't as jovial and cracking as many jokes or not smiling as much, and doing a variety of other things which people got angry at because it was so counter who he was. So having the diagnosis helped our entire family deal with who he was and who he'd become. And now we're all working very hard to keep him as healthy and happy and have as positive a quality of life as possible.
Nice. Nice. That's great. Can you guys tell the audience a little bit about your experience with clinical research and all the different studies that you might have participated in over the years?
Ken has consistently volunteered for just about everything that is possible, partly because that's who he is, and partly because he helped the field better understand both the diagnosis and hopefully at some point come up with a cure. So he's volunteered. As you know, he's even he's planning on donating his brain, which he will jokingly say that it can only be diagnosed through an autopsy, but he's going to wait on that one.
And can you tell me a little bit about why you volunteered for research? What Michelle was saying?
Yeah, I want to help whoever can find out what's going on with various problems. Strong as I like to be now, but I'm better than I was in court.
Ken, you used to be a lawyer, so
Yeah.
words were your life.
Ken was actually a trial lawyer. So words were clearly his life, and he was very frustrated before the diagnosis, not understanding why he would forget something for his client. And after the diagnosis, we stopped taking active clients immediately because he felt it was unethical. He's still someone who they call because he still can think of things more than he gives himself credit for. But it is challenging for him to speak the way he'd like to be able to speak.
Can you tell us what were the good things about participating in the research study? What you liked about it?
The good things were that I would ultimately help people who had with PSP.
Some of the positives, as far as I'm concerned, were the regular work that we got with you and Monsi. So we really got almost just sort of regular checkups. And it gave us a little bit of a sense of his progression, which, because there's so much about that, as far as I understand, there's so much about this disease that's not understood, and there's no roadmap like there is for many others. So for people like us who are used to being in control, it's a little frustrating. But he also worked very, very hard at all of the components, and actually he still does with regular physical therapy and occupational therapy. So I think that part of the study also helped him realize the kinds of components that he wanted to keep doing to keep his life functioning the way he wanted to have it.
What would you advise people to expect, and to, how can they plan for participating in studies?
Well, I think it really does vary whether or not you're going to be in person or virtual. So the in person where we went, it actually was a very long day, and I think that it would be actually helpful to break it into two halves for a lot of people, or at least prepare them for the fact that they're going to be exhausted. So that's one piece. In terms of the virtual, I thought he found it pretty enjoyable. He looked forward to them, even taking some of the visual tests, and he liked challenging himself with the physical components, and chatting with you and Monsi on a regular basis. So I think that for us, the virtual was a real positive, and we would have appreciated being part of the other, and we understand why he couldn't. But it was a very challenging day for him. So I think that needs to be. I'm sorry, huh?
3 days to recover.
Yeah, it took him at least 3 days to recover. think he found the virtual ones to be a little less taxing, and the full day with questions and other physical pieces to be extremely taxing.
For other people who are or thinking about research, what would you advise them? What would your recommendations be?
Do them as much as possible. I would like to help as much as I can.
I would say that that certainly Ken, as you know, wants to do whatever he can to for himself and for others. It's always been who he is. But what I would say to particularly the wearables is that it will help you gain, it helped me gain some greater insight, and it helped him gain some greater insight into what he couldn't do. So I think that, so people who might be considering doing different kinds of trials, if they can understand that they too will benefit, not just other people, but they too will get hopefully some benefit from it. He didn't want to believe he couldn't do some of the stuff. He didn't want to stop the walking without the walker, which we stopped. So it was important for us all to learn what could and couldn't do over that year-long process.
I want to also echo what you said about, it's so great to be able to see patients in research trials, because we get to see people much more frequently. We have a closer relationship. And the way clinical medicine works, we can't give that kind of sort of personal attention to all of our patients that we give to our trial participants. So that is really been wonderful, I think, for both me and for our research coordinators. Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit about like how, as a caregiver, as a care partner, what your role was and how much sort of effort and time it took for you to help with all the research?
Yeah, I sure. Basically, I would just, set up the dates and things of that sort and prepare the video, prepare the Zoom. And then I would be with Ken throughout the session, which I guess they were between 45 minutes and maybe 2 hours, depending on what we were doing that week. So it was, setting up, if he had to walk a certain distance, we had to measure it and, put the red piece down so that he could, walk on the ribbon. But, it was real. And I guess parts of it were a little nerve-wracking when he was doing some of the walking, because he was unsteady. So I was there he had a belt on, and I was there to make sure that he was safe. We're also doing it in our kitchen, which has an extraordinarily unforgiving floor. So I'm really, really careful that he doesn't fall on it. But most of the work really was done by him. The only piece that I said earlier that I was responsible for was theoretically every night marking down whether or not he had a fall and almost fall or whatever else. And that was a bit unnecessary because the machine didn't work all that well. But he did most of the work. I just partnered with him.
Is there anything else that you'd like to, tell people in the audience about, research, or about anything else?
Well, the only thing I want to share is that I'm glad that you're doing videos with folks who have PSP. I think it is helpful, very helpful for people to see others who were very different, because even those three people had very, very different ways of the illness impacting them. So, some people will speak more clearly, probably, and be a little less frustrated than he is, but they'll be frustrated at something else. So I think that it's important that you continue doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Is that pretty fair comment, honey?
Very fair.
Okay.
On behalf of the AFTD and the FTD Disorders Registry, I'd like to thank Ken and Michelle for sharing their experiences with Dr. Wills. And Dr. Wills, thank you for your presentation. We have a little bit of time left, so let's take a few questions from the audience. Dr. Wills, the first question is there a test to determine if I have PSP?
Yeah, I mean, so PSP, it's really a clinical diagnosis, so it's very much based on the exam. MRIs are very, very helpful in terms of confirming and also ruling out mimics of PSP. There are also some blood tests that we use to rule out mimics, but it is still a clinical diagnosis, and that's sort of why, like, the CSF markers and the special imaging studies would be so helpful, to have like a really clear test. Like, right now we don't have a DAT scan. We don't have the synuclein skin biopsy like we do in Parkinson's for PSP. And so, this is one of the challenges in terms of the certainty of the diagnosis. But yes, it is still, there are, a lot of sort of clinical features that are very, very characteristic. And so, your physician will be able to look at those and look at your exam and give you hopefully a good idea of whether you have the disease or not.
Thank you. So you mentioned MRI, and there's a question in the audience about MRI. Can you see tau on an MRI?
Can you see what?
Tau?
Oh, tau? No. So these are all like at the cellular level. Like, you can't see it structurally at all. The closest thing you can see is with those special dyes that are still in research and aren't approved, and we'll see what happens with them. But so there's no way to actually see those teeny tiny proteins if you're looking at like the brain structure using MRI.
Great. Another question, this is from a person who has the MAPT gene. Will the clinical trials in treatment for PSP help them?
I'm very optimistic. So the interesting thing about the MAPT mutation is, of course, it is specifically a tauopathy. Like, you actually know why it's happening. That mutation is affecting the tau protein directly. And so, for example, those antisense oligonucleotides that are in development, and actually they're being tested both in Alzheimer's and in PSP right now. But if those were to work, then I would expect them to be particularly relevant to somebody with a MAPT mutation.
Great. And then somebody's asking if their loved one can still participate in PSP research if they have additional diagnoses.
So it depends. So a lot of trials are somewhat strict about having people who are healthy in every other way. It sort of depends on the trial. So sometimes, for example, you'll often have to have blood tests and an EKG and things like that to make sure that you don't have any additional, like, liver disease. Liver is really, really important in these studies because that's where most drugs are metabolized. And so if people have liver disease, then they often can't participate. Same thing with the kidneys. The kidneys are really important for getting rid of the drug after you're finished with it. So there are good reasons for these exclusion criteria in these clinical trials based on your health otherwise, and it's really for your own safety. So anyway, so it depends, and it's complicated, and you just have to sort of go and do all the testing and find out really.
And someone wants to know if they need a study partner to participate in these research trials.
So that's a great question. So I would encourage you to have a study partner as much as possible. I think it's really important, both in terms of the logistics, but also just like the support, like having somebody who, you know, you can bounce ideas off of and, you know, run through the consent form with you and things like that. I think is really valuable. The most intervention studies, most of the like drug trial studies will want some sort of caregiver who can help and you know, make sure that you can get to and from the site and things like that. Sometimes, for example, like with the registry study, things like the more observational studies, you don't necessarily have to have a caregiver, but it's nice, but you don't have to.
Great. And then someone is asking, if you enroll in one of these clinical trials, can you stop participating whenever you want?
Definitely, yeah, you can always withdraw, and there's no like penalty or anything. I mean, it's always up to you how long you want to participate, if you want to participate, and if you decide that you don't want to participate anymore, you let, you know, your physician, your site know, and then they should be able to, you know, basically do maybe one more visit just to make sure that you're healthy and safe and nothing's gone wrong, and then basically you would be done. So yeah, that's always an option. Yeah.
Great. I have one last question for you before we wrap up. In these clinical trials, can you only participate if you are early in the disease stage?
So similar to the discussion of like other comorbidities, for drug studies, they tend to want people who are earlier and, you know, able to walk, for example, and, you know, people who are going to be, you know, willing to come in and able to come in regularly, frequently to the site to participate. And so, so there is a bias definitely towards people who are early stage in the disease. Observational studies tend not to be so strict. They tend to, you know, want people at all stages, and partly also that's to like describe the whole spectrum of the disease. So it does depend. It does, you know, if you find a study online, for example, through the clinicaltrials.gov, you can reach out to the study coordinator or the investigator and ask them, you know, if you would qualify, and then they can, you know, give you some basic, easy sort of questions, hopefully to find out before you even come in. Or you might have to go in and be evaluated and everything to find out. So there's not like 100%, you know, rule here. But yes, we obviously we want people to participate at all stages of the disease, and we're, you know, I'm personally trying to make that easier for people with these types of virtual at-home trials and assessments.
Yeah, and I'd just like to highlight for the registry that having people participate at all different stages of the disease is really going to give us a lot of information to help guide the clinical trials that are ongoing and starting up. Thank you, Dr. Wills, and thanks to everybody who submitted a question. Before I wrap up, I just want to talk about CurePSP. CurePSP's mission is to raise awareness, build community, improve care, and find a cure for progressive supranuclear palsy, as well as CBS and multiple system atrophy, or MSA. CurePSP works to provide educational materials and support groups for people affected by these conditions, and advocate on the behalf of its community, and drive awareness of PSP and related conditions, and more. I want to especially highlight CurePSP's network of 33 centers of care across the United States and Canada. These regional centers of care enhance access to early, accurate diagnoses and quality care, and promote collaborative research. As mentioned, Dr. Wills is the director of one of these centers of care at Mass General Hospital. Visit psp.org to learn more. Please let us know if you have any questions or comments about today's presentation. And if you have any further questions about FTD, you can contact the AFTD helpline using the information on the left side of your screen. And be sure to sign up for the FTD Disorders Registry if you haven't already. And you can visit ftdregistry.org to learn more. Thank you so much.